Once again, thank you for joining us today for the opening keynote of the Arts and Environmental Justice Symposium. I would like to introduce the moderator of today's keynote discussion, The Cultures of a Just Transition, Alexis Frasz, co-director of Helicon Collaborative, who also spent countless hours co-strategizing and curating the series of events you're all registered to attend this week. Thank you, Alexis. Alexis is a researcher, writer, strategic thinker, program designer, and advisor to partners in culture, philanthropy, and the environmental justice sector, working for transformative change and a just transition. She leads Helicon's work at the intersection of culture and the environment, and her perspective on systems change draws on her artistic practices and diverse background in anthropology, Chinese medicine, permaculture, and Buddhism. She believes in the need to build solidarity between artists and culture and broader movements working for racial, ecological, and economic justice. She also teaches on creative civic leadership for artists and non-artists and is faculty for the Cultural Leadership Program at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity and Julie's Bicycles Creative Climate Leadership Program. Her research on socially engaged artistic practice has informed artist training curriculums and philanthropic programs worldwide. She's actively engaged in Helicon's ongoing work to address inequalities in cultural philanthropy. Alexis graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University with a degree in cultural anthropology and has pursued master's level study in Chinese medicine. She's an advisor of the Public Bank East Bay, the Headland Center for the Arts, and the Artist Literacies Institute. She lives in Oakland, where she spends as much time as possible in her garden. Please join me in welcoming Alexis Frasz.
Thank you so much, Sepide, and thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to be able to kick off the symposium with you today. I'm joining you from unceded Ohlone territory in what is now called Oakland, California. I'm a white woman with blue eyes and short bleach blonde hair cut shorter on the sides. I'm wearing a black shirt and I'm sitting in front of a couple of Shepherd Ferry posters that say "We the People." So as we get started, if you're just joining us, feel free to rename yourself in Zoom with your name, your location, and pronouns if you like. And feel free to say hi or introduce yourself in the chat. We expect this to be a dynamic conversation and we hope that it stimulates ideas and conversations for you. And feel free to converse with each other in the chat. If you do have things that you'd like to ask the panelists, we will have time for Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom for that, and we'll make sure that we see your questions. I want to thank Donna Ellis and Rachel McGarry from the Deaf Hearing Communication Center for their ASL support today, and we have closed captioning as well. So we had a wonderful land acknowledgement in the opening remarks, and for those of you just joining, I just want to reiterate that Mural Arts is happy to be able to offer this at no cost to you to ensure as many people as possible can participate. But we do encourage you to donate to one of the Indigenous organizations on Lenape land where Mural Arts is located. The list will be dropped in the chat or in your own place, an Indigenous organization that you know of in your own place. And this action is actually deeply relevant for the theme of this convening. As Councilmember Brooks just said, environmental justice is really about recognizing and repairing the harm that has been done to places and people that have been colonized, used for profit, and considered sacrifices. The genocide and forced migration of Indigenous people is the original environmental injustice in this country. And of course, we know it's still ongoing. And yet, from colonialism to today, Indigenous people have continued to be fighting for sovereignty over their bodies and land. And not only is this a fight for environmental justice, it's also a fight for cultural justice, because the cultures of Indigenous people are inseparable from the places where they have been for thousands of years. So think of your donations as a small act of solidarity and reparations. I'll briefly introduce the theme of this session, and then each of our panelists will speak a little about their work, and then we'll follow that with some conversation between them and then Q&A with all of you. So as we've said, this is about culture and environmental justice. And environmental justice really emerged in the 70s as a civil rights struggle. It was a response to the fact that low-income communities and communities of color were disproportionately harmed by pollution and environmental degradation because of racist policies and practices. EJ activists insisted that environmentalism couldn't just be about wilderness and non-human nature as it had been until then. It must include people and the places where they live, work, and play. So this session is about the cultural dimensions of a just transition. Many people are saying we can't go back to the way things were before COVID, before the summer of racial justice uprisings, the year. And of course, these recent crises are simply symptoms of a larger systemic problem. We now know that things must change, but if we aren't going back, where are we going? The idea of a just transition is really about understanding that it will take a conscious process to change our economy and our culture to one that is more aligned with well-being for all and with a living and healthy planet. And ultimately, that this process needs to follow the leadership of the people who are closest to the problem. Our speakers will talk much more about this. And if you're new to these ideas, you can find more information at a link that I will drop in the chat, among many other sources of information online. So to help us have this conversation, we are joined by three people who have been leading movements for climate justice, disability justice, and Indigenous sovereignty for a long time. Patty Byrne, Judith LeBlanc, and Michelle Mascarenhas-Swan. I'm humbled and honored to be able to be in conversation with them today. Together, we will explore the links between these seemingly different fights for justice and how they are increasingly converging. We'll talk about the common cultural roots of the challenges we face and the role of creative practice in societal transformation. I'm going to turn it over to them in a moment, and as part of our introductions, we'll also create space for an access check-in around any needs we may be bringing into the room. This is something that I learned from Patty, and for my part, my needs are met, except please do put your questions in the Q&A box. And as far as your needs, this is a longer session, so please feel free to stretch, stand up, turn your cameras off, and we understand that you may need to do those things in order to be comfortable, which we want you to be. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists and ask them, in addition to sharing a little bit about your work and how you come to this topic of a just transition, please give us a sense of a formative experience or a person that shifted or shaped how you approach your work today. I think it's really useful sometimes to see how people got to where they are. So we'll start with Michelle. Michelle Mascarenhas-Swan is a member of Movement Generation, a collective of organizers, educators, and creative activists working for a just transition in Oakland and beyond. She's a co-founder of the Climate Justice Alliance, which is a growing network of frontline communities coordinating to shift culture, finances, power, and many other things. Michelle?
Thanks, Alexis. Yeah, I'm really honored to be on this panel with these amazing panelists and to be with all of y'all this morning. It's morning for me on unceded Ohlone land, where I am, also known as Berkeley, California. I am a South Asian femme-presenting person with shoulder-length black hair, wearing glasses and a red scarf, with brown skin and dark brown eyes, sitting in an office with yellow and orange walls behind me, and pictures on the wall of our ancestors, Grace Lee Boggs and Mike Brown. Yeah, and I don't know, who comes to mind for me is maybe about a decade ago, when I was in Detroit at a Grassroots Global Justice Alliance gathering. Chaz Wheelock, who is also an ancestor now, and was a co-founder of the Indigenous Environmental Network, and a member of the Oneida Nation, just generously spent a lot of time with me that weekend and really instilled in me this notion that, humans have done a lot of damage, inflicted a lot of damage on this earth that we call home, that is home, but that doesn't call on us to shrink or to reduce the mark that we leave or yeah, but instead to be a regenerative force and to really almost like expand really the impact that we have in a regenerative way, just like beavers or fungi, that we can really, yeah, just have a really reparative and healing impact that is critical at this moment on the clock of the world, as ancestor Grace Lee Boggs taught us. So yeah, I'll start with calling Chaz in and, all of our ancestors into this space with us. Just give thanks for that, for them. Yeah, and then this is a picture of my crew, the Movement Generation, Justice and Ecology Project Collective. And if I could have the next slide, thanks. And you're gonna have to just kind of click through kind of quickly because these are, yeah. So eco, the root word eco really just means home. Oh, if you could go back just a little bit. Yeah. Are you going back or let's see, can I? No. Trying to figure out the slide technology. You can just go back one more. Okay. Yeah. So eco means home. Go ahead. Okay. Ecology is the knowing or knowledge of home. Next. Ecosystems, right, are the relationships of home, and they can be as small as a drop of water or as large as the whole planet. It really just depends on how we draw the boundaries of home, right? And so ecology is that knowing of those boundaries and really the relationship between the wind and this plot of land, the relationship between, creatures and beings and sun and spirit. So it's not a catalog of the individuals, but it's really about relationships. Next. And these are all critical in understanding economy, which is just, well, in sort of Greek nomenclature, it might be called the management of home, or we might like to say the care of home, how we as humans meet our needs rooted in ecosystems and a knowing of home. And economy or the management of home can be done well, or it can be done poorly, right? It all depends on the decisions that we're making and how we're organizing that management of home. Next slide. And so at Movement Generation, and our work is deeply linked to the environmental justice movement and the wisdom of communities on the front lines of this crisis, these crises, interlocking crises. And we really think about this term ecological justice as what we're working towards, which is really about the reintegration of human communities into the web of life in a restorative, reflective, responsive relationship to place. Next slide. We can think about the pillars or even like threads of economy as having these kind of core components. Go ahead. Work, or we might even put here bodies. Movement Generation has been engaged in a study with SIN's Invalid. Very grateful for that. And we've been engaging in conversation with disability justice communities through SIN's about work and what it really means. And here we're talking about everything from the beating of our hearts to the care of like texting or, making a call to a friend to check in and make sure they're okay, to the gut level reaction or emotions or feelings that we may be having which is actually work, right? It's telling us something about the impacts that we're having, the impacts that others are having on us, as well as, growing food or caring for children, or, there's all kinds of work that human communities do to manage or care for home, right? So work, we think, is one of the central components, or human bodies are one of the central components. Next. Take work plus resources or life sources, clean air, healthy lands, water, and then you apply those to meet. Next slide, or next, yeah. Purpose. And all of this, go ahead, is rooted in a worldview, a culture and cosmology that makes this particular equation make sense. And then that is rooted in, next, governance, how we organize ourselves to make this kind of economy work. And then next slide. And so in the extractive economy, we see that resources are, go ahead, garnered through kind of a dig, burn, dump system of extraction. And then work is applied through exploitation, right? We're sort of forced to play different roles in the economy towards a purpose that is all about the enclosure and accumulation and enclosure of wealth and power. So all of these things have to move towards that as the ultimate, really, purpose of the economy. We can say that the economy is about lifting all boats or, increasing equality, but if in fact the process of the economy has only led to more and more enclosure of wealth and power, then we can't lie to ourselves and say that that's the purpose, right? And then the worldview of this kind of system, go ahead, is rooted in the myth of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, consumerism, there's a whole colonial mindset. These are the stories that we're taught from such a young age about this is a meritocracy, right? You lift yourself up from your bootstraps and you can get ahead. Or, everybody has equal opportunity, or, the self-made man, the rugged individual, right? These are all the stories that we're taught in this system that make this whole equation make sense, right? Governance then in this system is one of militarism and systemic violence, as well as wealth held and exercised as power. And then next slide. And so it's really critical that we have a story, right? That we have a vision of how we move from this extractive economy that breaks hearts and destroys lands and peoples to, move into, to transition into a living economy or living economies, multiple economies, right? Ways of knowing and understanding our bioregions, like the places that we live, that is rooted in care and, again, like restored relationship. So this framework is one that Movement Generation developed really very much in deep partnership and learning from communities in the Climate Justice Alliance and the Our Power campaign. So we can chat a link to this framework and you can download it for free on our website. And then next slide. So when we think about that part on the right, the living economy, we might actually think about it more as a spiral than a linear kind of flow. And at the center is of a regenerative economy, is, go ahead, is worldview, a culture and cosmology of caring, and sacredness. Go ahead. And this is critical, right? If the worldview that we all had today was similar to, the one I was just talking about, that our ancestor Chaz Wheelock, was talking to me about, of the United Nations, for example, of all Indigenous communities, which is really about the sacredness of life and of all of our relations, right? If we were rooted in that, there's no way that we could have developed such a extractive, destructive economy, right? So the center of regenerative economy has to be this like different way of thinking and understanding the world. Next. Yeah, and then the purpose of economy becomes very different, right? Go ahead. The purpose becomes ecological and social well-being rather than accumulation and hoarding. Yep, next. Work, go ahead, is done in cooperation and in some ways, go ahead to the next one. We can't separate this from the life sources that we rely on through regeneration. That work must be regenerative. It must fuel us, right? It must give us joy and life. And the way that we interact with the living world around us to meet needs must also be regenerative, right? And we know this in our bodies when something is regenerative and when it's not. And so really paying attention to that. Go ahead to the next one. And then governance is really about collective self-determination. Rather than, so all decisions made at the smallest scale of governance, that it makes sense, rather than sort of being imposed from top down. And this, requires a whole different way to think about ourselves in the system, right? Not just as voters or consumers, but as actors in every realm that we're in, whether that's our families and households or neighborhoods and communities. So I think those are all really important pieces. I do want to point out that the images in this framework are pretty ableist images. They're, similar, like bodies that are not moving in different ways or all standing or, and so, I just want to name too, that this is a living, breathing process that we're in. Just transition requires our willingness to navigate the contradictions and also to challenge ourselves and the ingrained colonial mindset and privilege and ableism that we have, that many of us have. And so, I just want to name that I'm excited to be on this panel and in the spirit of learning and, co-learning together with all of y'all. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. And okay, sorry, I was having some technical difficulties. So that was amazing. And the Just Transition framework is such a powerful structure, I think, for so many groups that are working along this, and just having a common lens has been transformative. Next, we'll invite Patty. Patty Byrne is the co-founder, executive, and artistic director of Invalid, which is an artistic project that's led by and centering the experiences of queer and disabled artists of color. Patty is nationally recognized for having to establish the framework and practice of disability justice. Patty?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And I know on the West Coast, where I am, it's early in the day, and thanks for the folks that are here after lunch. My name again is Patty Byrne, and I work with Invalid, which, as Alexis said, is a disability justice-based organization. And I wanted to identify a little bit about myself. I am a Japanese Haitian femme presenting person. again, hailing from Haiti. I said that rather quickly, and Japan. And I am wearing a polka dot green and white scarf, and I have my hair in 2 buns on my head, and my background has probably 3 altars that are visible to family ancestors, as well as movement ancestors, as well as all of the beings that are on the planet that are giving us so much. In terms of an access check-in, it's a practice that we use in disability justice spaces, and that is where we identify what allows us to be in the space and fully present. So for myself, for example, my access needs are that I speak slowly. I'm not a fast speaker, and that people are patient with that. Canter. And I think also that I might, during the course of our conversation, pause to drink or even pause my camera for moments. And that is what will allow me to be here for the next period with y'all. And I invite other people to name their access needs again in the chat to make sure they're met, or with each other as panelists. People have kids, people have, parking, etc. And I also wanted to acknowledge that I am on the west coast of the continent on unceded Ohlone territory, also known as Berkeley, California. And I wanted to introduce a little bit about disability justice to folks because really regrettably, many people have understood disability as an individual phenomenon, as something that a person must overcome, which is really in line with the medical, industrial complex, which identifies people with disabilities as kind of tragic victims of circumstance or genetics, and that's kind of horse crap. Bodies come in all ways, right? We are as beautiful at 5 years old as we are at 10 years old, as we are at 50 years old and 70 years old. Bodies change over time. If you look at a field, everything is not going to look the same. If you look at a grove of trees, they're not all going to look the same. And it would be kind of absurd and unhelpful if they did, right? We know that monocropping is not ideal, and we don't want things genetically identical in people. And so we're up here in lots of different ways. We embody life in different ways, and humans are just as variable as anything else. In each body that we occupy, every body has strengths and needs. So from this framework, we started an organization. Maybe we could skip to the next slide. And this is since Invalid, as folks can see. And if you see me peering around, it's because I am trying to see my screen better too. And we are a performance-based organization. We center disabled folks of color and disabled, queer, and gender nonconforming, and trans folks with disabilities. And obviously the overlaps therein, right? We have, trans people of color, for example. We're basically a brown queer crew. And our work has been shown all over the world through the internet, and we've toured all over the US. But as importantly as our cultural work is, if we can go to the next slide, we also are engaged in movement building work. And the movement building work is, key for us because we are, again, like it's so unrecognized that, disability oppression, ableism, is an institutional force and not just an interpersonal or kind of internalized oppression. And so we do a lot of work, as Michelle mentioned, with folks from other movement contexts to engage in learning, unlearning the frameworks around disability. And we're so enjoying the work that we're doing with movement generation and with other organizations, but with movement generation study group that we're doing on bodies and land, and the overlap of climate justice and disability justice is critical because folks with disabilities are what one might call a frontline community. The way that I got involved in this work is that I always assumed that in the event of an earthquake or some other essentially natural disaster, which was brought on most likely by human greed and capitalism, I always assumed that I would just die because I'm a wheelchair user, and who's gonna come in and save me, basically. Like, the government has demonstrated that they'll let folks with disabilities die, right? They'll even euthanize us. So, with this framework, I kind of just assumed it's all my life because we've lived in ableism, or we are in ableism. And my friend Micah Bazant, who some people might know, was like, no, like, that's not unacceptable. He's one of my besties, and he was like, no, that's not how we can live. That's ridiculous. And he introduced me to the way that we can understand the climate justice movement, or even before the climate justice movement, the climate crises, right? The climate chaos that is occurring and has been occurring, that we can understand it differently than just happening, and we have no response to it, right? I was kind of just overwhelmed by, quite bluntly, ableism would enforce itself through abandoning disabled people of color. And he was key for me in saying, like, no, like, I love you, I want you to live. And moreover, like, disabled people of color need to be acknowledged. Queer folks with disabilities need to be seen in our movements. And I mean, while I had engaged in, overlapping, folks from other movements in different ways, the idea that climate justice movement people would actually understand that folks with disabilities were at super high risk, and in fact many of us experience disabling conditions as a result of climate chaos. And we just experienced that for a year, right? This has been a giant disabling period with the pandemic. Many of us have become disabled through illness and, the long haul COVIDers, or survivors of COVID. Anyway, point being, it really shifted my thinking to how do we live together, and if we are going to go down, right, how do we want to see ourselves living or perhaps dying in this historical moment. And we can do that loving each other and together and seeing each other. Or we can do that in isolation. And it's clear that we need to be together in order to survive. And, this is well before the pandemic. And I mean, if nothing is a demonstration of, the need for, collective action, the pandemic certainly has been. So if we can go to the next slide. So it's my story, is I love Micah, and Micah's demonstrated that his love for me is a case in point of how our movements can be in love with each other as well. So, my goodness, my computer has frozen a tiny bit, so I'm going to not read the slides, but allow folks to read the slides themselves. I know that's not the most helpful. This slide has Eduardo Galeano on it, speaking about solidarity, and essentially, and I wonder, Alexis, if you can read this slide out loud for folks to make it.
Disability justice goes beyond securing rights to recentering our collective humanity and human needs, while acting as a force to transform and reorganize our societies in accordance to these needs and planetary wholeness. Do you want me to read the part under his picture as well?
Yes.
So under the picture, it says, "I don't believe in charity, I believe in solidarity. Charity is so vertical, it goes from the top to the bottom. Solidarity is horizontal, it respects the other person. I have a lot to learn from other people."
Can we go to the next slide? So over time, folks with the disability justice analysis, and again, disability justice being, a generation old, kind of building on the shoulders of disability rights. We began meeting and developed some common understandings of disability justice, and we put together, within Sins and Valid, we kind of distilled it down to 10 principles, but really these principles are not exclusive to any organization or even any movement, right? And I wondered, Alexis, if you can read the next slide. It's, again, my screen is freezing on them.
Yeah. We understand disability as a lived embodied experience, as a political identity framed within ableism, as a community location from which to organize, as a political location which overlaps, intersects, and responds to other political locations such as race, gender, class, nation state, etc., and as an aesthetic from which we create practice and culture.
Can you stay on for a second, Alexis?
Yeah,
as we
I'm here.
do the next slide. So the 10 principles I was referring to are listed here. On the right side is a poster with the 10 principles listed, and on the left they're listed just in regular text. And Alexis, if you can read the left side.
Yeah. Intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted. 3, anti-capitalist politics. 4, cross-movement solidarity. 5, recognizing wholeness. 6, sustainability. 7, commitment to cross-disability solidarity. 8, interdependence. 9, collective access. And 10, collective liberation.
Thank you so much. And it looks like I was able to make my thing unstick. Wow, technology. And if we can go to the next slide. I can read those now. Alexis, thank you so much. And what Alexis is doing right now is, besides being awesome and collaborative, is one example of, a principle of disability justice, which is collective access, that we can, not be ashamed of our needs. Why there's no reason to. That we can meet each other's needs for support and essentially, as an act of solidarity and as an act of love, just step in, right? I mean, this is a very natural human thing, but we're taught, oh gosh, like I have to be afraid to say what I need, and I'm going to look less than, and we're only going to look less than if we think that disability is over there and we are over here, and that disability is a place of shame and need, and actually it's disability is just another way of inhabiting a body. And again, it's a cultural expression as well, and aesthetic, in the ways that we move differently, in the ways that we sound differently, and the ways that we may speak differently, etc. Right? Like that's, I mean, quite frankly, nothing short than hot. That we are in our bodies, and we can be proud of who and how we are. And that's really a core tenet of disability justice, is a belief that we are valuable, because, quite frankly, we all are, right? Every person, every body is valuable and beautiful. And to go to the next, this slide, the first slide. Do you like reading, Alexis, or shall I read?
Either way, whatever works best.
How about if we go back and forth?
Okay.
Okay, cool. So, intersectionality is not a disability justice principle alone, right? Of course, this was shared originally by Ms. Crenshaw, and this was so long ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. She introduced the concept that we've all lived, that every person has multiple identities, and that we don't, choose, okay, today I'm disabled, and tomorrow I'm, multiracial woman of color, etc. I mean, these were all inhabiting all of our identities at the same time. And we experience oppression or privilege in a way that acts almost like a fulcrum, where in one moment we can have, for example, education privilege, and in the next moment we are experiencing racial oppression, right? All these things are active all the time. Do you want to share the next one, Alexis?
Sure. Shared principles with other movements. So this is about calling for the leadership of people that are most impacted. Disability justice is led by disabled people of color and queer, gender nonconforming, trans people with disabilities.
So, when we see movements that are saying, for example, that they are for, climate justice, and they're everyone is white, I would question, for example, how committed they are to the leadership of those most impacted, right? Because those most impacted are, it's a brown planet, so of course it's like Black, brown, indigenous people, and we must be represented and in fact in leadership of movements for justice, specifically with disability. Disability rights did a lot to move forward an understanding of disability as a social phenomena, that we are in fact disabled by our exclusion, not by our body or body minds, and at the same time, disability rights was a very white movement, and so disability justice, standing on the shoulders of disability rights, moved into leadership of those most impacted, meaning those of us that are brown and queer and trans, non-binary. anti-capitalist politics. When Michelle was talking about the extractive bases of our bodies, I mean, we actually have non-conforming bodies and minds, folks with disabilities. And so kind of by nature, so to speak, we cannot be extracted from in the same ways that others have been. And, you know, I only want to go through a couple more that are with respect to time. And we can talk about this more when we're in back and forth conversation. But I do want to skip to the next slide because those are the disability justice specific ones. Are we at number 6 on the small slide?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. I wonder if you can read number 7 for us.
Sure. Number 7 is committed to cross-disability solidarity. We understand disability to include people with physical impairments, people who are environmentally injured, chronically ill, people with psychological impairments and psych survivors, people who are neurodiverse, people with cognitive impairments, and people who are a sensory minority.
So oftentimes, you know, there will be access for one type of body mind and not for another. And in disability justice frameworks, you know, we don't kind of throw any sector of our community under the bus. I mean, there's, you know, we all need access, right? And, you know, that goes for elders in our work, that goes for people that, you know, don't have English as a primary language, that goes for, you know, folks with kids. It goes for people that are deaf. It goes for people that are mobility impaired, for people that are, you know, chemically injured. I mean, really, all of us need to be engaged in saving each other. And so these are, I mean, you know, I can go on and on about the principles of disability justice, but really, I think the bottom line is that we're all beings, human beings that deserve respect and justice and need to be engaged in our collective survival. And I'm sure we'll get into the details of DJ in our conversation. And I'm really glad y'all are here. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you very much, Alexis.
Thank you so much, Patty. And I know that these are on your website, on the Since Invalid website, as well as you have a primer that people can download.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Yes, we have a disability justice primer that people are welcome to purchase, or if you don't have the funds, you can always email us. But it's like $5 for an electronic copy. And
it's worth it. It's good.
Yeah, yeah.
Great.
And we also have cultural programs that people can kind of rent for free, some of our shows, and see it on Canopy.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I want to bring in our last but not least panelist, and then we'll have a conversation. So Judith LeBlanc, who is a citizen of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma and the director of the Native Organizers Alliance, an organization that has been deeply involved in a number of successful campaigns to get out the Native vote, to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline, getting Deb Haaland confirmed as Secretary of Interior. She's also on the boards of Illuminative and NDN Collective, organizations that are dedicated to both changing narratives and building power among and for Indigenous people. And Judith, when you, are you there? There you are, okay. When you introduce yourself, please also tell us about your work, but also please tell us somebody or something that has informed or shifted the way that you approach the idea of a just transition.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and I'm really very moved to be a part of this keynote opening. So my name is Judith LeBlanc, and I'm a citizen of the Caddo Nation, and my family's names are Donko and Edge. That is the way we always identify ourselves as Native peoples, because it's a small Indian world. and people know who you are or know your family or from one generation or another. I'm in this Zoom from Pamunkey territory, which is in Virginia. Usually I'm attending in the year and a half of pandemic. I am usually attending from Lenape territory, which is AKA New York City, Harlem, New York to be exact. And I'm one of the 80% of Indian people who walk with a high heel on one foot and a moccasin on the other. So I want to apologize that I do not have slides to share. I know for many people it is really helpful to have slides and to follow along. But I was visiting grandson for 2 weeks, and I'm a grandma, and we did way too many things, and I just couldn't get it together. So I have very long hair, which is piled up in a very messy bun on my head. I wear glasses. I have dark brown hair. I'm a brown person. I have very long shell earrings that are actually Lakota earrings, and they are quite the rage in Indian country, having very long earrings. I want to say that one thing that has changed my life, and I'm an elder, is participating in the movement to stop the KXL, the Keystone XL pipeline. I was invited to join a circle of Native leaders right after Standing Rock, and in January, right after Trump was inaugurated, to begin to map out the next stages of stopping the pipeline, because Trump had ran on the idea that he would restart that pipeline, and that he did. And so I have learned so much. I was invited by the Braveheart Society, which is a traditional women's society from the Ihanktuan or the Yankton Sioux tribe. It's a Nakota, Dakota, Lakota society. I also really had grown very close to people in that territory of South Dakota where the projected pipeline was to go, because I had lived there in 1973, right after the occupation of Wounded Knee, and preparing for the trials of those who had led the occupation there for treaty rights. You know, the KXL movement, 10 long years, and it's really a case study of how movements are the basis for transformational social change, system change, and how movements change people as well. You know, movements are a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of things for a very long time. But the transformational character of this movement and the KXL movement is almost a case study of how to make systemic change, how to relate over a decade to some very fundamental elements of movement building. And that is the weaving of a cultural strategy with a narrative strategy and an organizing strategy. Weaving those three strategies together, knowing all the time that each strategy will not play the same role and have the same amount of importance as we continue to build a movement over years. The narrative strategy, very clear from the beginning, that the KXL movement needed to be a Native-led movement with an Indigenous framework. Why? Because treaties are a constitutional right. They have gone unfulfilled, but they are a legal document that continues to be upheld even under right-wing dominated Supreme Court. Treaties are documents that were signed between nations, Native nations, Indigenous nations, and the federal government. And frankly, we are the only peoples in this country who have, since the beginning of time, lived on collectively owned land that is self-governed. And it's clear, and what has developed in the environmental justice movement is understanding of the narrative that in fact, native tribes, tribal nations are the only ones with the legal standing to fight the extractive industries, to fight and take a stand and make a stand to protect water and land. And the truth is, treaties are as important as, therefore, to Native peoples as they are to white people, because treaties are the basis that hopefully will be a part of expanding democracy and protecting democracy, because treaties are a constitutional right. And not all treaties were the same. Our people led and signed treaties that were mutual, consensual political relationships with the federal government. Some treaties were signed under duress and war, but allowed us to live and fight another day. And some were imposed on us. So not all treaties are the same, but they are the basis for us, especially in the environmental justice movement, to take a stand in the federal courts and to stand strong with our ancestors' hopes, our ancestral responsibilities. The cultural strategy, well, it's an indigenous framework, an understanding of place, an understanding of the history of place, and an understanding that we are, that, you know, set a recording to end this talk at the right time, and I can't even shut off the stopwatch. But an understanding of place, our relationship to place, understanding of our relationship to history, and our understanding of the role that we can play in the present in order to make life better for our descendants. That indigenous framework is the most important thing that the environmental justice movement should and must learn from the KXL pipeline fight, from the Dakota Access Pipeline fight, from Line 3 and Line 5, those fights in Minnesota and Michigan that are going on. The organizing strategy, straight up clear. Grassroots, tribal elected leadership, traditional leadership, elected officials, all of us trying to walk on the same path, because that is the way you build a majority-based movement that in fact stopped the KXL pipeline. After 10 years, the zombie pipeline that kept getting restarted. And the way that we stopped it was to put KXL on the ballot. For the first time in history, American Indians held a Native presidential forum where all of the candidates, the top tier candidates, participated for the first time, meeting with Indian tribal leaders, traditional leaders, grassroots leaders, and were asked the question, where do you stand on the KXL pipeline? We put the KXL pipeline on the ballot and got a confirmation when President Biden and Vice President Harris were nominated. We got a confirmation from them that they would, in the first day of their taking office, would stop the pipeline, and they did. Well, what does this mean? And what is the lesson learned? And I will end on this, that there are many different tactics. There's direct action. There are the prayers and the ceremony that held us together for 10 years. There's lawsuits. There's testifying at hearings. There's public education. There's artistic endeavors that paint a picture. There are stories that are told. But in the final analysis, it was grassroots political power, Native grassroots political power that was organized to make itself heard in the most consequential elections that we've ever faced, because it was a matter of life and death who won that election. And so I want to end by saying that movements are a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of things for a very long time. And an understanding of that breadth of engagement, that breadth of worldview, that breadth of understanding of the different kinds of tactics, but always being 360 degrees aware of how we are all in relationship, how all things are in relationship. That indigenous framework is really the lesson, the lesson that has changed many of our lives. You look at the white farmers and ranchers who understood place, their relationship to place, the history of place, and their role of protecting the water and the land that the pipeline would have destroyed. That's an authentic relationship that was built on an indigenous framework. That was a step towards ending the impact of systemic racism. And frankly, I think the future is indigenous. I think the idea that we are all in relationship, have been and will be, is really the lesson that was learned out of the KXL pipeline. And hopefully it will be shared as we go forward through some, I think, very difficult times in protecting Mother Earth. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Judith. And thank you, everyone. And we'll invite back into the room Michelle and Patty, and we'll have a bit of a conversation. And you, if you're listening, feel free to start dropping questions that you may have in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we will start to look at those and make sure we bring them into the conversation. So it's so interesting. There are so many overlaps already in how I think we're all talking about culture. You know, the idea that the dominant culture is sort of where the seeds of these very different problems have a common root in our dominant culture. And then the need to really shift culture as part of a just transition. And I appreciate, Judith, you bringing in the idea that it's not enough to just have a cultural strategy. It's culture plus, and I think Michelle and Patty, you both touched on that too. But I'm curious, Judith, because you said something very powerful when we were having a call earlier about this being the time to bring Indigenous medicine, cultural medicine, to systems change. And I think you've started to go there, but you know, the idea that this is, you know, often when we talk about the future that we want, it's new. But you're talking about something that really has never stopped being here and has been a practice over time. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little more about those cultural practices and values and how they've been sustained even in a very hostile environment and what we can all learn from them.
I think there is really no way to explain that Native nations continue to exist, continue to be at the center of innovation, despite the impact of systemic racism and the denial of treaty rights. And it is because it's an intertribal practice to understand the relation, being in relationship, that all things are related. During the pandemic, people began to understand that the healthcare workers' health was as important as your own family's health. That people understood that. I know I live in Harlem, and every night at 7 o'clock, you'd hear pots being beat and instruments being played and people calling out in tribute to the hospital workers and the workers in the supermarket and the transit workers, because people understood we're all related. And so we are in a moment, I think, where people are thinking differently about being a part of a global sense of humanity, being all on one place and doing things that have an impact on one another. You know, under the Biden administration, there are quite a number of opportunities and possibilities for making some changes happen. But the truth is that movements, as the movements are on this panel, cannot see each other as silos or separate, but interrelated. And I think an Indigenous framework is not about being Indian. It's about understanding that relationship. It's about understanding a place. It's about knowing that in the present, you bring the practical experience of our collective ancestors, not just your blood-related ancestors, and the concerns for all of our descendants. You bring that together in the present because what we do in the present matters. So I think that medicine of an Indigenous framework, of understanding that indigeneity is not about being Indian, but a worldview and an understanding of relationship. That is the medicine that needs to be, I think, a part of governing policies. If that Indigenous framework was used, we'd be responding to natural, quote unquote, natural disasters in a different way. We would have different kinds of government policies, and we would address the impact of systemic racism in a whole other way.
Yeah. Yeah, this idea of relationships, and also that, an Indigenous framework isn't just about Indigenous people. The same, I'm thinking of what you were saying, Patty, with the disability justice framework. It helps us see things that impact us as able-bodied people too, that were invisible because of our structure. And I'm just aware that people are writing into the chat, how liberating it's been for them to just be invited to be fully here, as a result of how you entered the space and what the offer was on the table. So I really appreciate that. But I'm wondering if you want to say anything more, Patty, about relationality and about this idea. I saw you nodding your head when Judith was speaking, so I'm calling on you.
Yeah, no, I think, Judith, thank you so much for your brilliance. And when you were saying the cornerstone, basically, is what I'm hearing of, not just the cornerstone, but the framework and the lens of relationship being indigeneity. I was thinking, well, certainly, that makes sense, and that echoes within disability justice. I mean, it is about relationships, and in all of our organizing, I mean, it needs to be about relationships, because that's what the world is. I mean, how can we not see the world as our relationships with other beings? And whenever we're organizing, I say this often when we're doing organizing amongst queer folks, we're organizing people with disabilities. When we're doing organizing, of workers, we're doing organizing of people with disabilities. And similarly, when we're doing organizing, of people with disabilities, we're organizing, Indigenous folks. I mean, there's no distinction amongst who we are. We're all like interrelated and human. If we're doing human organizing, and need to answer the call. I mean, the call's been put out there by the planet at this point, which it's absurd we've even gotten to the moment where, where we are. And I'm grateful. I'm very grateful for, all the responses that we've seen, and I'm still so concerned about I mean, we hear these things about what we can do. I heard something over the weekend through, I don't know, the New York Times about individual actions still, or even collective actions as humans, but unless essentially there's systemic change, unless corporations, are addressing their behavior, corporations and the governmental structures that support them. Yeah, that's what needs to change.
Yeah. Michelle, I want to invite your voice in here, and you can add anything you like, but I also, I'm curious because so much of this can feel, I think, abstract when we're talking about values and culture shifting. But I know you are doing so much work with communities on the ground who actually are living into different ways of being. And so if there's a way to also speak to some of the examples that maybe you've seen through CJA or even your own work in Oakland, of these kind of practices of different values and cultural worldviews.
Yeah, I mean, first, I just want to say thank you, both Judith and Patty. I feel very moved. Yeah, I mean, I first want to just name that, part of our work at Movement Generation, we feel like we're learning into this, but it is working to address ableism in our movements, and particularly in the climate movement. And I think, when I think about what ableism is, it's rooted in fear. And it's rooted in this myth of scarcity, right? That we've learned in large part from Indigenous peoples that we organize with or are in movement with, that's, you know, that's a lie, right? And just the way of like weaving into our movements a culture of love and abundance, you know, like, you know, our EJ movements have said no decisions about us without us, right? That's been kind of the central call from our very early on, that's rooted in an Indigenous, you know, worldview. And similarly, I think the call from disability justice movements about like no one left behind, you know, like when I think about that, I'm like, fuck, that's what, you know, sorry, that's what I want to live into. You know, I don't want to be part of a world or a movement that is not, you know, that is like forgetting or invisibilizing or, you know, any of us. I want to be part of something that is transforming these systems of fear, you know, and the only way we will do that is in relationship with each other, you know, getting to know each other and our quirkiness or our needs, our different, you know, different ways we are, the different ways our bodies are. And so, yeah, I don't know. I just think, yeah, also this piece about sacrifice zones and, you know, anyway, so back to your question about examples though. I mean, yeah, I think we see these examples everywhere. I mean, I'll just say one example in the Bay Area that's been very literally powerful is the Disability Justice Culture Club's work as PG&E, they're literally called, I'm blanking on the legal term, but they're a felon. They're a convicted felon of murdering 85 people and plus through many fires because of their criminal negligence. And it's because
the utility, just for people, yeah,
the electric utility, right? Gas and electric, and then because they have not done their work of maintaining the power grid lines properly, and because they're not in right relationship, which is rooted in not being in right relationship to the Indigenous tribes and communities all along, all over the territories that they're part of, who, you know, have tended fire for millennia and now are not allowed to in many cases. You know, they're not tending to their power lines, and then they're sparking these massive destructive fires. And then to address that, they're having these public safety power shutoffs periodically when there's high winds and high heat, and not taking on the impacts of that on specific communities, specifically the, you know, disability justice communities, like people who need power to live. And so it was the Disability Justice Culture Club who really like transformed the understanding of our movements, of what that intervention was about, you know, like that our movements needed to center disability in order to reclaim community power, you know, that we understand that our communities need to govern energy in order to survive this transition. You know, I think that's a really, that's an example of how how we're trying to reshape culture, and how disability justice communities in particular have been at the forefront of that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, and there's a couple of questions coming in from the audience that I want to get to. One of which is really about there are some artists that are joining us, people who self-identify that way, and then there's many more people that have a creative practice, and may not call themselves artists or a part of a cultural tradition. But there's a question about sort of the role of arts and culture specifically in that more narrow, not so culture as worldview way that we're talking about it, although of course they're related, in these shifts, and where any of you might be seeing arts and culture specifically play a role in movement work. And I'll just let anybody, I mean, Patty, you self-identify as an artist, but anyone can take this, I think.
and I'd love to jump in because I think that, you know, our imaginations are key in change and making change. And we all know that one of the most violent and you know, intrusive, invasive things that has happened within this political economy, the extractive economy, is that we don't, you know, it's taken our imagination, right? I mean, we're imagining, when we think about, you know, it's easier to imagine for many of us some dystopian future, right, than what a liberated future could look like, right? It's you know, our political imagination has really been stunted in this, you know, white supremacist nightmare, this settler colonial nightmare, you know, and I think that the role of art is key and central in offering visions for what could be, you know, and it's exciting to me. I love working with artists, because, you know, we can imagine, you know, anything and everything, right? And can we imagine, you know, what justice can look like, what love can look like, what connection can look like, what, you know, beauty and reciprocal relations and you know, just actually being in right relation with, you know, all the beings. Can we imagine that? And can we, you know, if we can't imagine it, it's not going to happen. You know, I try to imagine what it looked like before colonization, and when, you know, there would be, you know, flocks and flocks and flocks of birds, you know, and you know, what it might look like if there were, you know, I mean, we've even seen it, right? Like when the pandemic started, and it just took like a couple weeks for the birds and the whatever, you know, to like start, you know, flying more comfortably, at least in, you know, in the Hawaiian territory. It was so fast. It just really took a couple weeks to see, you know, critters feeling comfortable again, you know, and it's like, yeah, just pull back, humans, just a little lot. Anyway, I think, you know, the role of us as artists is to really support people imagining what a different world can look like, and then to motivate people to engage in struggle toward that. It's actually really fun to imagine what is going to happen. That's good.
You know,
Right.
the interaction between art and culture and organizing, it's been with us since the beginning of time, since dirt is what I like to say. I mean, there's no way to explain, for example, the petroglyphs in the mountains, or these amazing things that the Mayans did, the art that was created there. It was about sustaining us spiritually, building a intention, creating, you know, a good intention to move forward, kind of the art manifested, you know, all that people believed and hoped for and pointed the way. So we shouldn't act like we're discovering Plymouth Rock by saying, you know, arts and culture is so important to organizing. They've always been. And I think one of the things that strikes me, though, is that how to understand that there are practices that are cultural, that are truly and deeply political in the context we're in. So, for example, we are Native Organizers Alliance is collaborating with the Natural History Museum and a group called Cecilia from the Lummi Nation and the House of Tears, Lummi carvers, traditional carvers, and they have.
And the Natural History Museum is not the one that everyone's thinking of right now, right?
It's the Renegade. It's the one that shows. It's like the yes men of the natural history world. So the Lummi carvers saw the situation after the elections and realized our people need to come together to protect sacred sites. They read about the work that we were doing, bringing traditional leaders, tribal leaders, and grassroots organizers who've been organizing for generations since the beginning of time to protect sacred places from destruction, from extractive industries, from pillaging that's going on, for example, right now around Bears Ears in Utah. So we are on a journey. It's called the DC, the Red Road to DC. We will be on a journey going to the tip of the spear places, the places that are in motion right now with the Biden administration, calling on the Biden administration to act urgently and to remind the Biden administration of their ancestral responsibility to protect these sacred places, because it's a constitutional right, it's freedom to religion, but to do it in a way, to take this Lummi totem pole that tells a story of what is happening to all people, not just Indigenous people, but to all people in this moment of crisis, of the pandemic, of climate chaos, and to put the power of our prayers into this totem and to build that kind of trail of prayers and hopes and dreams to make political change possible. And so, some might say, well, it's a political event. No, it is a cultural event. It is an event where the lead is the creation of something that symbolizes the moment we're in. And frankly, the reciprocity connected to that is that the Lummis created the pole, but we're going to Bears Ears, to Chaco Canyon, to Line 3, to Line 5, to Dakota Access Pipeline, Standing Rock, to the Black Hills. We're going to collect the hopes and the prayers. But the truth is, we had to act with reciprocity. Less than 1% of all philanthropy is given to Indian organizations, less than 1% for many years. But when we were raising the money, we realized to bring that 24-foot totem, very expensive, to drive it on a tractor trailer truck all the way to DC, to bring the carvers, the families, and to bring communities together, that we also had to help raise money to give to the people doing the organizing on the ground. As a national entity, we have to know our role. And we did have access to funders who were excited by the idea. So each place will get a very large donation to continue their work. Each place to continue the work that's been going on for generations. But when we're organizing, we have to think about reciprocity, because reciprocity is about sacrifice. That although we want abundance, as Michelle was saying, the truth is we are still in a period of extreme duress in our communities. But we must sacrifice for one another. That's solidarity. That's what is about building movements of a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of things for a long time, because one organization does not control a movement. It's about all the groups coming together and seeing where how we weave each other, our needs and our power together to make big change, big systemic change. And I think the power of movements is seen in that idea, nothing about us without us. That was a slogan that was developed in South Africa by the disability justice movement there. And look how powerful it is today in every one of our communities. Nothing about us with a simple democratic principle.
So the overlaps here are, this felt long in the beginning and now it feels short. We're almost at the end. So I want to get Michelle in here for a last word, and then I'll close this out. But thank you so much. This is, the things people are posting in the chat are amazing, and I'm sorry we won't have time to get to all your questions, but we will, if you've asked a question in the Q&A, I know I'm reversing what we said before, but just they're really good questions. So if you feel like putting it in the chat as well, just so folks can see the question that is on the table, I think that would be great. And Michelle.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say briefly, because I saw a lot of chat, comments in the chat about like, what is the role of public art and artists, in relation to this question. And I feel like just being here in Oakland during, during this, in this moment over the last year, the murals that appeared overnight, every night, gave life to, just like literally painted a picture of what we were fighting for in such powerful and beautiful ways, in organic ways. And then I think about like, how do we utilize that kind of energy in moments like, here we are, the Green New Deal, the Red New Deal, the Black, Green, and Red New Deal, are the billboards that are going to be put up going to picture white men in hard hats with union placards, or are they going to be images of reimagining work and what it means to create a culture of care and reciprocity and solidarity that is rooted in, what Judith is saying, like the future is indigenous, land back, reparations. Those all have to be part of whatever we want to call it, but a Green New Deal, if that's going to be our kind of banner. The imagery that makes up that banner is critical to what we win or lose, frankly, like what we give up in some ways. And so, I just want to like really shout out and give thanks for artists in that fight.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the rest of this week, obviously, we will have many more conversations about the role of artists, but this was such a helpful and wonderful grounding, framing, and the intersections between all of your work are so beautiful. And just on the spirit of this sort of reciprocity, I just want to say, because Patty and I did that sort of tag team in the beginning where I was reading from the slides, and that actually nourished me. So I just want to say that, because I think there's this idea that there's sort of a gift being given from one side and a taking on the other. And that actually didn't feel that way to me. So, so I'll close us out for today. Thank you so much, everybody, the panelists and everyone for being here, and our interpreters. The sessions will be available on YouTube and the Mural Arts website within the day. So if you had to step out, or if you want to rewatch something. And this is it for today for the symposium, but please do tune in tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern time. We'll have a conversation around land and liberation, very apropos, ecological practice as creative practice. And at 3 p.m. Eastern time, we'll have a presentation and creative workshop entitled Climate and the Carceral State, Imagining an Abolitionist Future. So thank you so much, and we'll see you throughout the week. Take care.
Patty, no. Thank you.